Hello, everybody. We're starting the activities of our last day of meeting. Today we have a session with two very dear friends, and I'll present first Beatriz, and then I'll introduce you Noel. So, Professor Beatriz Marques is a professor at the Federal University of Mato Grosso, with a PhD from the State University of São Paulo. She has very important work in terms of the relationship of free will and agency. And considering that we are running out of time, let's hear Beatriz without further ado. We are very happy to hear Beatriz. Please, the word is yours.
Thank you, Gabriel. I will take these first minutes just to thank the organization of the event, thank Gabriel for the invitation. I'm very happy to be here and talk to you a little bit about my current investigation interests. So I'm Beatriz. I'll be talking a little bit about the epistemic condition for more responsibility, or a epistemic condition for more responsibility, and this sensationalist other half of the title, the way in which it maintains structures of oppression, or at least that's what I'll try to show you today. So first, a brief overview of what we're going to do. I think the slide is going right. There are some common concerns about more responsibilities, so I'll go briefly over those. They are, I won't really dwell on those, but just to mention them. And then I'll try to talk a little bit about responsibility attribution and the context of power asymmetry. I think this is the interesting point about which I would like to reflect a little bit with you today. And then I'll want to talk a little bit about sense of agency, because I think it will help us understand a bit how these power asymmetries enter our interactions without us being very aware of them. And then finally, I want to draw some conclusions about the epistemic concerns that I'm worried about. So first, let's start with some common concerns about more responsibility. These are not anything very new. It's something you all probably heard about, which is just the so-called freedom conditions for more responsibility. So it's usually concerns that turn around whether we would have free will if determinism, causal determinism, turned out to be true, and what would that mean for more responsibility. So some people claim that more responsibility requires the ability to have done otherwise. A more compatibilist point of view will say that control or acting for reasons or responding to reasons are the conditions for more responsibility. I won't be getting into that today. So I'm just mentioning these to situate what we're talking about, but this is not my concern today. I'm more interested in the epistemic conditions today. So there are a few of these alleged epistemic conditions for more responsibility, and they are not a point of necessary agreement. So some philosophers believe there are such things as epistemic conditions for moral responsibility, that others think there is not. And one of the main ones that perhaps many people would agree would be that the agent needs to be aware of what she's doing when she acts in order to be morally responsible for the action. So I'm not particularly concerned about that condition either. I'm more interested in the condition of that requires that the agent is aware that what she is doing is condemnable or wrong. So in some sense, that's the moral significance of the action. So someone who might defend this is Zimmerman. I think he's one of the most outspoken for this condition. There are others like Neil Levy and Gideon Rosen. And this is, of course, a dispute. Some people might say that the agent doesn't need to be aware that what she's doing is wrong or condemnable in order to be morally responsible for the action. So keeping in mind that we're not concerned about causal determinism today, I'm closer, this discussion is closer to discussions that follow Peter Strawson after Freedom and Resentment. So these discussions, in many ways, they tend to focus on the attribution of moral responsibility and when is it justified to attribute moral responsibility. So they accept that we attribute moral responsibility every day in our interactions with other agents, and they wonder about when are we justified to attribute responsibility and what makes us justified to do that. In Strawson terms, that might be what makes one an appropriate target for reactive attitudes. So he might answer something close to the quality of the will, but I won't be getting into that right now. Because actually, I'm more interested in talking a bit about responsibility attribution in the context of power asymmetries. So power asymmetries will be relevant to this discussion because I'm thinking that moral ignorance sometimes, moral ignorance in the sense that the agent isn't aware of the moral significance of her action, it's not always an epistemic failure. It can derive from power asymmetries in the social structure. So the social structure that I'm talking about are social norms that perpetuate the power imbalance. I'm thinking there are like a whole variety of social norms, but to make matters a little bit more easier for discussion, I'm going to focus on a specific kind of power asymmetry, which is gender, which is related to gender. So gender here, I'll conceive it as a normative term because it compels people to act in a certain way. And mostly I'm interested in the idea of gender schemes, which are just social norms that perpetuate the structure of power by attributing social position and function, say reproductive or laboral, based on bodily categorization or characteristics. So what I think this kind of perception about the social context in which we live, the fact that we are situated agents brings out is a concern that has been brought into the discussion by Michelle Siouria, and she tries to show that if we're concerned just about these conditions that I mentioned that are commonly discussed in philosophy of action, for instance, then we might have some agents that do not fulfill the requirements. So allegedly, we would not be able to hold them responsible, but that we might have interest in actually holding them responsible. So An example that she uses that I like, I think makes this more evident, is if we think about, for instance, the manager who sexually harasses the employees that he supervises. And it so happens that the manager in question, he doesn't quite realize that he is sexually harassing the employees. He doesn't have that concept. He wasn't taught the concept growing up. He thinks that he's innocently flirting with the employees. And he perhaps was raised in a patriarchal or sexist household that encouraged that kind of view. And this kind of makes it very difficult for him to recognize the moral dimension of his action. Still, it does seem a little bit odd to not hold this agent responsible, or so I think. Okay, so thinking about this, Silvia, she proposed the whole theory, and I'm not going to get into the discussion, the whole discussion, of course, but what I think is interesting to focus on is that she proposes this ameliorative method in which the idea is that some concepts carry an oppressive perspective of what is conceptualized, while at the same time giving the impression that it is bringing out the essence of what is conceptualized. So she thinks that something like that is happening to more responsibility. We have a normative system structured by power symmetries. So what she's trying to say is that when we blame agents, when we think it's justified to attribute more responsibility to them or to make them targets of reactive attitudes, our idea that we can blame people, or the recognition of people as appropriate targets for blame, may vary across social groups. So some social groups will be blamed more easily, and others it will be harder to blame. And so she thinks that blaming should not track, for instance, the quality of the will, but it should contribute to the hierarchy of power. I'm sorry, it should track the contribution of the agent to the hierarchy of power. So it's a different point of view when it comes to more responsibility. Now, keeping that in mind, I would like to move on a little bit to the discussion of the sense of agency. And sense of agency here, I mean something that many people probably already heard a lot about. I won't get into the specifics of this. It's just the experience or the feeling, actually, of originating action. I noticed that neuroscientists often refer to it as the feeling of making something happen, like bringing about an outcome. And it is commonly associated to this computational model of the comparator model. I won't really get into any of this discussion either. I just had the slide to make clear what I'm talking about, and to claim that I will accept these conclusions about the sense of agency. I won't critically discuss any of it. Okay, so what I'm interested about in the sense of agency are some experiments about action selection. So action selection can be more fluid, so it can have fluency, or it can be a bit more conflictive. And it turns out that when action selection has fluency, people seem to have a higher sense of control of the outcome of the action. So I think some results are interesting. For instance, Barlas and Obi, they had this experiment in which agents they had different trials. In one trial, the agent could push a button, and that's all she could do. On the other trial, she could push one of 3 buttons, and in the last one of 7 buttons. And it turns out that having options boosted her sense of agency. So she had this feeling of control over the outcome of the result when she had more of the feeling when there were 7 buttons. Another interesting result, especially in relation to this one, to the first one, is one in which you had to select left or right arrow. So, sorry, left or right button according to a left or right arrow that showed up in the screen. But the investigators, the researchers, they primed the agent with an arrow which was below conscious perception. So it was subliminal priming. So they primed them with an arrow either to the left or to the right. So what happened was that there was a prime, the left arrow, for instance, and then on the screen it showed, for instance, the left arrow. So the subject was supposed to press left. And sometimes it happened that there was a primer for the left arrow, and then on the screen there was a right arrow, and they had to press then the right key. Obviously, when the prime was compatible with what showed up in the screen, the agent acted faster, and the subject of the experiment acted faster, and of course had more fluency in her action selection, right? She could tell what she had to do very fast and very easily. There was another experiment to rule out response time effect in the result. So it turns out that when it's easier for you to choose to select the action, there is a boost in the sense of agency, even if you're being primed to act in that way. So if it's subliminal priming and the agent is unaware of it, she will have a boosted feeling of control over the action. And then finally, there's this other experiment, and there are a few after this one. This is just the first one, in which, as it turns out, obeying orders reduces the sense of agency. So I think there's also one in the sequence in which giving the order also reduces the sense of agency. So apparently no one has a lot of sense of agency when they're ordering and when they're obeying orders. So it's kind of interesting when we think about taking responsibility for what happens under these circumstances in which actions are being ordered. Anyway, that's not relevant for us. So obeying orders reduces the sense of agency. So this is interesting, right? Having choices boosts the sense of agency, of the control over the outcome, and picking the action easily also boosts the sense of agency, even if you're being subliminally primed towards one action. Now, following orders that are explicit, if someone tells you what to do, then that reduces the sense of agency. Okay. So now moving on, I would like to reflect a little bit about these results, thinking about what Nick Brancasio says about how gender shapes the sense of agency. So she claims that action specification is disclosed through habituation. Now, she uses this inactivist vocabulary, but I think that what she's saying can be easily translated in vocabulary that is not an activist, but I'll play along for the moment. So action specification will be disclosed through habituation, that is, by being being habituated to that action in a certain context, in a certain situation that will repeat itself in similar ways. So the possibilities of action then are limited by the patterns of interaction, that is, the social interactions the agent gets used to throughout her life. Now, she claims that perception is also habituated by the success and failure of interactions. So gender schemes, those set of rules that we talked about, result in the agent not perceiving some courses of action as open to her, while other agents might perceive it as open to them. And that will vary then according to the social norms imposed for each individual. So even if we're unaware of these gender schemes, which we usually are, these patterns of interaction habituate action. And while habituation primes responses to the environment through habituating the agent into having certain intentions in certain situations. And for her, this is an important point, this action-taking process, the process of responding to the environment, is providing the sense of agency. So she's thinking that the fact that some actions are open to me or not, according to the gender schemes, modes what I will feel I can do in each situation. So that's the take home of what she's saying. So I'm concluding that the social context primes action. And if these experiments that I mentioned about the sense of agency are correct in relation to action selection, then people may feel more in control when their action is actually primed. So that the social context kind of gives them the cue of how they should behave in each situation actually makes them feel more in control. That's what I'm assuming. I'm concluding from what we discussed. This kind of makes sense if we think that we get the feeling that we know what we're doing, right? So I know what I'm doing in that situation, and I just do it. We know what to do. So these social schemes may be priming action, and through that, boosting the sense of agency, although we are unaware of these social schemes, the gender schemes in this case. I think this is relevant to power asymmetries in the sense that some actions will be possible or perceived as open for people of certain social groups, while not possible for others. And some interactions will be possible depending on with whom you're interacting. So this leads us to the final question. What does that mean for the epistemic concern, right? So I think it means that moral ignorance may eclipse the social structures of oppression that habituate action. So when we're talking about whether an agent is morally responsible for her action, and we're wondering about whether she was morally ignorant or not, if she knew that the action was wrong or was aware of it, then we might not be taking into consideration the structures of oppression that habituate action. And I'm not claiming that this is the case for every case of moral ignorance, but for some cases of moral ignorance. It seems that a boosted sense of agency contributes to habituation. Selection of certain actions will be in conformity with the gender schemes, so the agent will feel she's allowed to act in this habituated way, or at least that's an open possibility. Even if the victim might protest to that action, that is, if the victim would dislike the consequences. This disregard for the victim's protests is something that I think is relevant. And I think in cases of power imbalance, it is enough to disregard some epistemic concerns. And those cases are the cases in which moral ignorance derives from power imbalance. So in these cases, awareness of harmful consequences for the action should be enough for attributing moral responsibility. That should be enough of a requirement. And I think that's reasonable because the social structure is such that it is rigged in a way that the agent will easily be unaware of the moral significance of her action. But it seems unfair to the victim not to blame this person, say the manager that I mentioned, that example. It seems unfair not to blame him because the power asymmetry favors him. It is, the structure of society is so organized in a way that it will be very easy for him to not be aware that what he's doing is wrong. So it seems like that might not be the best indication or the best condition for someone to be morally responsible. If he can foresee that his action will cause harm to the victim, that seems enough to say that he just disagrees with the victim, that there is more reason to do otherwise, or that the harm to the victim constitutes more reason to do otherwise. So this might be more of a moral disagreement with the victim than moral ignorance, in fact. And in that sense, I'm somewhat agreeing with Matthew Talbert. And so those were the conclusions, and I thank you for listening to me.
Hello, Beatriz. Thanks a lot for this brilliant talk. I really like your new line of research, like kind of binding your original work in agency with a more social and political approach. Actually, you still had 2 minutes, Beatriz. You were very fast, just on time. So, yeah, questions. I have a bunch of questions myself, but as the host of the section, I'll give other people priority if they want. Of course, Thomas will have to jump in this discussion. That fits pretty well with the kind of approach Thomas has. Please, Thomas, jump in.
Good morning. That was great. I too appreciate this direction. I wanted to ask, or here's a way maybe of framing what you were doing that might give you within the current legal structures a sort of legal analysis of what you're talking about. So when it comes to epistemic conditions, we already have those in the law, for instance, that operate when it comes to excuses. And in the case of something like someone who's psychotically delusional, so like an insanity defense, the idea is it's not just that they didn't have access to the reasons or the moral significance. It's that in their state, they couldn't have had access. So it wasn't even the sort of thing that was accessible, right? Same thing with infancy. So it's not that infants, I don't mean infants, like children, juveniles, however, 10-year-olds. It's not that they had access to the fact that what they did was condemnable, but they acted despite that. It's that in that context, they're not developed enough for us to say that they even could have had access. So in those contexts, just basic legal context, we already allow that there's this kind of epistemic condition. But that doesn't apply to the kinds of cases you're talking about, which is why I thought it was interesting. So here's what I had in mind, and maybe this helps you, maybe it doesn't. Take not the sex offender, the offensive sexual boss, the guy who's making inappropriate comments. What you might say is, if he doesn't know that what he's saying is inappropriate, he's responsible because he's exhibiting a kind of negligence about the wrongness of what he's doing, right? And so he's responsible at this sort of bare level. And the way we normally cash out responsibility is like what a rational person would think was appropriate. And rational people don't think that's appropriate, even though lots of people might think it's appropriate. Like a rational, impartial person wouldn't think it's appropriate. So he's like responsible at that level, but you'd still want to distinguish that person from the boss who knows it's not appropriate, who's precisely being inappropriate to be nasty and mean-spirited to the employee. And you'd want to say that person is yet more responsible. So you want to draw the distinction in a way that you don't collapse the negligently abusive boss from the purposely abusive boss. And the epistemic condition will help you do that. Because what you might say is in all of those cases, from like negligence to purposeful behavior, even if they didn't have access to the moral condemnable nature of their behavior, they had it at the time. So it's not like it wasn't accessible to them. They just didn't access it. They're the types of beings that could have had the right reasons. They just didn't. And that's different than people who were excused, right? Where there was no sense in which they could have even had the right reasons. I don't know if all that helped. That's what I was thinking. But I'm a fan of Michelle's work. I think she's awesome. So I'm like happy that you're working in the same vicinity because it's something that hasn't been explored. But that was my sort of a legalized way of trying to come up with the framework for what you're already saying. So that was great. Not what I said, what you did was great. So thank you.
Hey, thank you so much. It's actually a great opportunity to discuss this with other people. Yeah, I haven't really cast it out in a way that it will be super easy to separate who is actually doing a nasty action or behaving badly knowingly from one who isn't. So I still haven't gotten there. But what I've been thinking about a lot is how I think that what's been motivating some of this discussion that I didn't mention is how I think that there is a certain epistemic perspective that underlies this sort of behavior. So there is a certain epistemic perspective that prevents agents from realizing realizing that what they're doing is condemnable. For instance, the manager who doesn't recognize moral reasons to do otherwise, he probably has a worldview, a perspective that is distinct from, for instance, mine and from the next person. And these will be epistemic perspectives based in some biases, some perhaps ideology, which I assume we all have one. But what I think that is actually relevant is a certain attribution of value to agents. So what I'm thinking is that the agent who does not recognize, for instance, harm to the victim as a reason to do otherwise, he doesn't recognize it because he is not attributing value to the victim's interests at the same level that he attributes to his own interests. So he will be biased in a way that he will perceive these people as having less of a claim. Now, I haven't really developed this or worked it out in this presentation, for instance. But yeah, I think that doesn't still give me a way to make the distinction that you mentioned, which is just distinguishing someone who is knowingly and willingly doing this from someone who is somewhat unaware because they're raised in this way and perhaps would act differently if they had been aware, if they had been told or taught or something like that.
Good. So can I just a quick follow-up? So first, and if you are interested in this, you can reach out to me and we can talk about maybe how to do it. Noel would be a great person to work on this. But so you could be interested, like as a parallel inquiry, but whether or not people track these distinctions. And I think they're going to track them. And one way of thinking about it, what you just said is, let's imagine you have someone who is behaving in these sexually inappropriate ways in a society that is primarily egalitarian, where it's clear you're not supposed to behave that way, right? And someone who behaves this way in like a patriarchal society, where it's not clear that you're not supposed to behave this way. So you can just embed agents in different structured societies in scenarios to see whether people take that sort of stuff to be relevant. It wouldn't answer your sort of metaphysical moral question, but it would like speak to whether or not this sort of framework you're interested in is already, in some ways, people are already drawing these distinctions. Like set aside whether you can figure out where to draw the line. It may be that people are, without realizing, already drawing these lines. And so that's one thing that you could do. So that's just a suggestion. I mean, it's not exactly what you're doing, but it would be a supplemental thing, which might be nice. And you can surely find, you can imagine this in different contexts. You can even do it in different places where they do have more or less patriarchal societies. And so that's one way that you might go about doing it. But like I said, it's amazing, but I'll let other people ask the questions. I'm very sorry to monopolize. Thanks.
Thank you so much.
It's a great discussion, by the way, guys. Does anyone has a question? Because I have one as well. We still have like 5 or 7 minutes.
I have one, Gabriel. I raised my hand there.
Okay, so please, I haven't seen your hand raised. Please, Anara.
Thank you very much, Beatriz. It's just a clarification question, because you use the idea that gender is normative because it compels people to act in certain ways. And I'd like to know exactly what you mean by compels, determines people to act in certain ways, or just incline people to act in certain ways, yeah? And another concept that you use is exactly the idea that some concepts carry on oppressive perspective. And I'd like to know as well, which kind of concept are you thinking, about that they carry on this oppressive perspective? What are you thinking when you say this? Just this was very good, so thank you.
Okay, thank you for your questions. Well, gender is normative, and in the sense that it compels people to act in certain ways, in the sense that these gender schemes will apply to people who are in society without them ever asking to be categorized into one gender or another. They will be categorized based on bodily characteristics. And that will mean that certain functions and certain roles will be attributed to each of these people due to their gender, to like the label, to whichever label they get. So,
okay, I understand that, yeah.
Yeah, so certain behaviors will be encouraged if you're, say, a woman, and certain behaviors will be encouraged if you're a man, and there is some kind of bad feedback if you don't fall well into those categories and you don't act accordingly. So it's not deterministic, it's just that gender will have you act according to certain rules that aren't really told to you explicitly. They're just part of the social way in which we interact. And that's the idea, that we interact in certain ways that habituate us to certain patterns of interaction. So in that sense, gender is normative, if that makes sense. And then the ameliorative method that Suhya is proposing is, and I hope I'm pronouncing her name correctly. So the method is kind of a alternative to our analytical and concept analysis that we usually do in analytical philosophy, in which we look at this concept and then we look at how it's used and that sort of thing. And we try to come up with what's that kind of thing that is to which the concept is applied, or whatever it is that whichever way that we analyze concepts in analytical philosophy. So she's saying that some concepts actually they are used and they are not they're not as innocent as we may think. They're not bringing out the essence of something. So for instance, gender is usually analyzed as, I don't know, some kind of essential aspect of human beings, when in fact, some people might argue, like feminist philosophers, that gender is a social construct. So when you reconceptualize gender in that sense, in that way, you're showing that some things that at first seem to be essential about the person, the woman, for instance, according to her gender, these things that seem to be essential at first are not actually part of her essence. These are just the concept of a woman, for instance, just carries some social expectations about what a woman is. And these social expectations will also bring with them some social oppressions towards that kind of individual. So the idea is that when you conceptualize in a ameliorative method, you're trying to bring out what is actually the social weight of these oppressions that in regular analysis are hidden under the guise of essential analysis of that, or bringing out the essential aspect of what is conceptualized.
Okay, great, got it.
We have 2 extra minutes for questions, so I go for mine now. I think I can have the opportunity. Beatriz, my question is the following. You said something about the relationship of a boosted sense of agency contributing to habituation, meaning a selection of certain actions in conformity with the gender scheme. I would just like to see, how do you connect that with the fact of the second claim that you're proposing, that a habituated way, kind of open possibility to kind of awareness that the victim does like the consequences, this kind of learning process involved in the social interaction, in the social interrelationship. So I'd like to hear a little bit more on that.
Okay, thank you. That's a difficult one. I'm not sure I was super clear on that stuff, but so the idea is that this kind of habituation of action primes us to act in certain ways given certain social situations, and these social situations are structured by gender schemes, right? These are these schemes already structure the way that we're gonna act in general. Of course, that sounds like an overstatement, but if we think about it, gender kind of guides a lot of what we do. So we're even the way we sit, right? So certain ways in which we act, certain actions will be habituated by these gender schemes, and the situations that come up throughout life, we're gonna recognize as open possibility. And this doesn't have to be conscious at all, right? We don't have to be, oh, okay, I can do this now and I can do that. This is probably not conscious, actually. We're just, that's what Brancazio is calling taking action, right? The situation kind of asks for that action at that moment, and we respond. So this leaves us with some agents or all agents or many agents, depending on how much you're gonna accept what I'm saying. So perhaps many agents or all of us act in habituated ways in several situations, and these habituated ways in which we act are sort of not very consciously, non-consciously telling us the ways in which we're allowed to act in certain situations. So being allowed to act will vary according to the gender, what you're allowed to do. And this will, what I'm trying to say is that this speaks louder than to many agents. Then I'm realizing that what they're doing is disliked by the person who suffers the action, what someone we may call the victim. So the victim may protest, she may not like it, but in the habituated way in which one feels more in control and one feels like it's the way they're allowed to act, it will make them feel as if this is the normal, the standard, the okay way to do things. And the victim might protest and not get much of a response from that. However, I don't think that is enough for us to withhold responsibility attribution. I think we can still attribute responsibility if it was foreseeable for the agent that the action would cause harm. So I don't know if that answers you very precisely.
Yeah. Now I see better the connection between the agency and the habituation process. That was very clarifying. So I just want to request you a big round of applause for Beatriz Marques.
Thank you so much, guys.